Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where you will get to listen to some of the best short stories ever written. As a youth, Neil Gaiman fell in love with Avram's stories. Philip K. Dick adored him. Ursula Le Guin thought his tales wonderful, and Ray Bradbury compared him to Kipling. Each episode will include a special guest, an amazing short story, and a discussion of that story. Enjoy classic tales such as O'er All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, The Sources of the Nile, and many others.
How could you be? It sounds like a story to me, yeah. Sounds like a story to me.
Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Avram Davidson universe. I'm really fired up to have today's guest, Robert Lopresti. He is an award-winning mystery writer, retired librarian, and current president of the Short Mystery Fiction Society. He's a novelist and the author of more than 70 short stories, one of which was chosen to be reprinted in Best American Mystery Stories of 2016, edited by Elizabeth George, and Year's Best Dark Fantasy and Horror 2016, edited by Paula Guerin. His stories have appeared in Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, 30 plus of them, Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, The Strand, and several anthologies. He's also written several novels. I actually found out about him when I was doing some research for the story, The Lord of Central Park, and I saw a blog and a review that he'd written, and I had to meet him. And today we're going to be discussing the necessity of his condition. We'll be listening to it as well, which is it was originally published in 1957, April, in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and it won a first prize contest against some really strong competition. As always, please write a review or write something on your blog. Let people know about this podcast. Spread the word. We've got a bunch of books coming out. We just published Skinny recently, which was a never published Auburn story that we found with yellow pages, and it's fantastic. And with that, I am looking forward to chatting with Rob. Robert, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh my gosh. Well, I found you, fortunately, when I was doing some research on the Lord of Central Park, and I read your review, and I thought, oh my, number one, I absolutely used it and I gave you credit, but I absolutely had to meet you and learn more about you and how you found Avram and talked about Lord of Central Park and all these other things. So maybe start with how you first found Avram.
Well, I think that story was published in 1970.
Yeah, it's 71, I think.
Yeah, and I was in high school and I had already subscribed to Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. And as far as I know, that was the first time I encountered Avram. Certainly it's the first one that made an impression on me.
And what about, I mean, it's so whimsical and different. I mean, is it very different than many of the stories that are published? I mean, what are your thoughts on that story?
It's unique unto itself. There's nothing else like it. It has a wild imagination and goes in many different directions, and it has a very flowing or florid form of language, which goes perfectly well with it. I mean, just see how long it takes to recite the Lord Drew and Gruel's titles, which he does several times in the course of the story.
Right.
He's obviously having so much fun.
And in terms of, I was thinking from I know you're not big on the movie things, but one of the things that struck me was that you wrote, this is a film. I mean, how come this hasn't been turned into a film? I mean, that was my thought exactly. It's just ready to go. It's almost like packaged.
Nobody in Hollywood ever asked my opinion. So.
So was that the first story of Avram's that you'd actually read? That was
the first one that I remember.
Okay.
If there were others, which there certainly might have been an Ellery Queen, because I've been reading it for a year or two.
Okay.
But if so, they did make an impression on me.
Okay. And tell, I gave a bit of an introduction about you, but what are you working on today now that you'd love people to know about, that we should be looking out for?
Well, the current issue of Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine came out last week. It's the September and October issue. And it features my story. What's the name of my story? A taxonomy lesson.
Okay.
Which I enjoyed. I hope some other people enjoy it. A story that is more, perhaps more like Lord of Central Park a little bit, is a story that's coming out in September, if everything works out properly. Josh Pachter, who's a wonderful editor of short story anthologies, has a book coming out called Monkey Business, which is short stories, crime stories inspired by the movies of the Marx Brothers. And he invited me to write a story inspired by At the Circus. There's a famous story that Groucho Marx told about At the Circus, that the man who is in a gorilla costume, pretending to be a gorilla in the movie, was fainting from the heat, so he punched holes in it with an ice pick. So I thought it would be fun to have a circus where somebody was doing that and somebody punched holes in the guy with the ice pick instead.
Okay.
So that's what happens in my story, At the Circus.
All right.
It's actually very unusual for me because it's a fair play mystery. You can figure out who the murderer is, which I don't usually write.
I'm looking.
And that's supposedly coming out on my birthday, September 19th.
All right, we'll have to check it out and put it out there. In terms of, one of the things that I found really fascinating about you is I'm so focused. When people think of Avram, they're so focused on science fiction and fantasy, but he won the Edgar Award, and he has just as many mystery and crime stories as he does on the science fiction and fantasy side. And, I just thought that was kind of fascinating in terms of, your background and any thoughts on that.
Well, I don't know. I think science fiction, luckily for them, has a wider and deeper fandom than we do, if you follow me. I mean, I'm not sure there are more readers. There probably are of science fiction, but they tend to engage more in fan kind of stuff than mystery does. And that might have something to do with it. And I don't, mystery people tend to obsess more about novels than short stories. I don't know if that's true about science fiction.
I think it's the same.
So people who specialize in mystery short stories, and I don't know if Avram ever writing a mystery novel. I know he wrote science fiction novels. And that may have in fact held him back in the mystery world.
Well, so he wrote, interestingly enough, he wrote two of Ellery Queen's novels.
I forgot that.
and also he has at least one unpublished story that it's Beer, which will be coming out really soon. I'll have to make sure to get you an advanced copy to take a look at.
Thank you.
But yeah, absolutely. Anyways, I just find it fascinating that kind of, I don't think there are that many authors, maybe one or two that have that Edgar, Hugo, and World Fantasy Award winner.
Yeah, definitely not that many. John Collier, I think, and he definitely had the fantasy and the Edgar, and Harlan Ellison, had at least the science fiction and the thing. By the way, I was talking about myself and how modest I am, but there were two things I wanted to mention. One is the place you read my review of the story is Little Big Crimes, which is a place where I review every week the best short story I read that week. And I actually reviewed Lord of Central Park because I didn't read any stories that week I liked that much. So on those occasions, I go to a classic. But the other thing I want to mention is that I'm the president of the Short Mystery Fiction Society, which anyone who is interested in mystery fiction can read for free, can join for free. Just go to the website or go to Google and type in Short Mystery Fiction Society. And then you can join us and the 600 plus members talking about mystery fiction short stories.
That's great. Yeah, I mentioned that in the introduction. I know earlier before you got here, but absolutely, I joined. I'm really looking forward to taking part in it and learning more. Well, today's story, we're going to be listening to The Necessity of His Condition. And is there anything you'd want to talk about before we listen to it, or do you want to save most of your comments for after, or any thoughts leading up to it?
I think I'll save my comments for afterwards, but except for one thing, which I noticed in the introduction to the investigations of Avram Davidson, which is where I have my copy of it. They point out that at least one magazine, this was published in the 1950s, at least one magazine rejected it. They said it was a great story, but they couldn't publish it because of the subject matter, which in the 1950s, you can understand. But I'm very proud of the fact that Ellery Queen said, yeah, we'll publish it.
Yeah. No, and I think also, and I'll probably go into more of this after we listen to the story, but it's a subject that I think most, certainly science fiction writers, most fantasy writers, most mystery writers at the time might not have been focused on, which I think is impressive. And Avram touched on these type of themes in a lot of his stories, and I'll save that for after. So let's get to it.
Okay.
The necessity of his condition. Sholto Hill was mostly residential property, but it had its commercial district in the shape of Persimmon Street and Rampart Street, the latter named after some long-forgotten barricade stormed and destroyed by Benedict Arnold, wearing a British uniform and eaten with bitterness and perverted pride. Persimmon Street, running upslope, entered the middle of Rampart at right angles and went no farther. This section, with its red brick houses and shops, its warehouses and offices, was called the T, and it smelled of tobacco and potatoes and molasses and goober peas and dried fish and beer and cheap cook shop food, and the spit and whittle humorists claimed Old Man Bayless's office, where the windows were never opened, never had been opened, they said, never were made to be opened. Any smell off the street or farms or stables that found its way up to Bayless's office was imprisoned there for life, they said. Old Man Bayless knew what they said, knew pretty much everything that went on anywhere, but he purely didn't care. He didn't have to, they said. J. Bayless, attorney at law, his worn old sign said, had a large practice and little competition. James Bayless, broker, his newer but by no means new sign, did an extensive business, again with a little competition. The premises of the latter business were located not in the T, but in a whitewashed stone structure with thick doors and barred windows down in the bottom, as it was called, near the river, the canal, and the railroad line. James Bayless, broker, was not received socially. Nobody expected that bothered him much. Nothing bothered Old Man Bayless much. Bayless, with his old white hat and his old black coat and his old cowhide shoes that looked old even when they were new, turned old on the shoemaker's last, the spit and whittle crowd claimed, directly they heard whose feet they were destined for. It was about 25 years earlier, in 1825, that an advertisement, the first of its kind, appeared in the local newspaper. Take notice, it began. James Bayless, having lately purchased the old Arsenal building on Canal Street, will henceforth operate it as a Negro depot. He will at all times be found ready to purchase all good and likely young Negroes at the highest price. He will also attend to selling Negroes on commission. Said broker also gives notice that those who have slaves rendered unfit for labor by yaws, scrofula, chronic consumption, rheumatism, etc., may dispose of them to him on reasonable terms. Editor Winstanley tried to dissuade him, he said later. Folks, he told him, won't like this. This has never been said out open before, the editor pointed out. Bayless smiled. He was already middle-aged, had a shiny red face and long mousy hair. His smile wasn't a very wide one. Then I reckon I must be the pioneer, he said. This isn't a big plantation state, it never will be. I've given the matter right much thought. I reckon it just won't pay for anyone to own more than half a dozen slaves in these parts. But they will multiply. You can't stop it. I've seen it in my law work. Seen many a planter broke for debts he's gone into to buy field hands, signed notes against his next crop, or maybe even his next 3 crops. Then maybe the crop is so good that the price of cotton goes way down and he can't meet his notes, so he loses his land and his slaves. If the price of cotton should happen to be high enough for him to pay for the slaves he's bought, then, like a dumbed fool, Bayless never swore, why, he signs notes for a few more. Pretty soon things get so bad you can't give slaves away around here. So a man has a dozen of them eating their heads off and not even earning grocery bills. No, Mr. Winstanley. Slaves must be sold south and southwest, where the new lands are being opened up, where the big plantations are. Editor Winstanley wagged his head. I know, he said. I know. But folks don't like to say things like that out loud. The slave trade is looked down on. You know that. It's a necessary evil. That's how it's regarded, like a... Well, he lowered his voice. Nothing personal, but like a sporting house. Nothing personal now, Mr. Bayless. The attorney-broker smiled again. Slavery has the sanction of the law. It is a necessary part of the domestic economy, just like cotton. I suppose I should say, I love my cotton, I'll only sell it locally. People think I was just crazy. Slaves have become a surplus product in the border states, and they must be disposed of where they are not produced in numbers sufficient to meet the local needs. You print that advertisement. Folks may not ask me to dinner, but they'll sell to me. See if they won't. The notice did as predicted, outrage public opinion. Old Marsta and old Mrs. vowed no Negro of theirs would ever be sold down the river. But somehow the broker's jail, as it was called, kept pretty full, though its borders changed. Old man Bayless had his agents out buying and his agents out selling. Sometimes he acted as agent for firms whose headquarters were in Natchez or New Orleans. He entered into silent partnerships with gentlemen of good family who wanted a quick return on capital, and who got it, but who still, it was needless to say, did not dine with him or take his hand publicly. There was talk on and off that the Bar Association was planning action not favorable to Bayless for things connected with the legal side of his trade. It all came to naught. Mr. Bayless, young Ned Wickerson remarked to him one day in the old man's office, "Whoever said that a man who defends himself has a fool for a client never had the pleasure of your acquaintance." "Thank you, boy." "Consequently," the young man continued, "I've advised Sam Worth not to go into court if we can manage to settle out of it." "The first part of your advice is good, but there's nothing to settle." "There's a matter of $635 to settle, Mr. Bayless." Wickerson had been practicing for 2 years, but he still had freckles on his nose. He took a paper out of his wallet and put it in front of them. "There's this to settle." The old man pushed his glasses down his nose and picked up the paper. He scanned it, lips moving silently. "Why, this is all correct," he said. To be sure. Received of Samuel Worth of Worth's Crossing, Lemuel County, the sum of $600 cash in full payment for a Negro named Dominic Swift, commonly called Domino, aged 36 years and of bright complexion, which Negro I warrant sound in mind and body, and a slave for life, and the title I will forever defend. James Bayless, Rutland, Lemuel County. All correct. And anyway, what do you mean $635? "Medical and burial expenses. Domino died last week." "Died now, did he? Sho, too bad. Well, all men are mortal. I'm afraid my client doesn't take much comfort from your philosophy. Says he didn't get 2 days' work out of Domino. Says he whipped him, first off for laziness, but when the doctor, Dr. Sloan that was, examined him, the doctor said he had a consumption. Died right quickly. Negroes are liable to quick consumptions. Wish there was a medicine for it. On the other hand, they seldom get malaria or yellow fever. Providence. He cut off a slice of twist, shoved it in his cheek, then offered a twist and knife to Wickerson, who shook his head. As I say, we'd rather settle out of court. If you'll refund the purchase price, we won't press for the other expenses. What do you say? Bayless looked around the dirty, dusty office. There was a case of law books with broken bindings against the north wall. The south wall had a daguerreotype of John C. Calhoun hanging crookedly on it. The single dim window was in the east wall, and the west wall was pierced by a door whose lower panels had been scarred and splintered by 2 generations of shoes and boots kicking it open. Why, I say no, of course. Wickerson frowned. If you lose, you'll have to pay my costs as well. I don't expect I'll lose, the old man said. Oh, of course you'll lose, the young man insisted, although he did not sound convinced. Dr. Sloan will testify that it was not a quick consumption. He says it was a long-standing case of Negro tuberculosis, and you warranted the man's sound. Beats me how them doctors think up long words like that, Bayless said placidly. Interesting point of law just come up down in New Orleans, Ned. One of my agents was writing me. Negro brakeman had his legs crushed in an accident. Man who rented him to the railroad sued. Railroad pleaded negligence of his fellow servant. In this case, the engineer. Seems like an unassailable defense. The young lawyer was interested despite himself. Well, what happened? Let's see if I can recollect the court's words. This was mere modesty. Old man Bayless's memory was famous on all matters concerning the slave codes. Yes. Court said, the slave status has removed this man from the normal fellow servant category. He is fettered fast by the most stern bonds our laws take note of. He cannot with impunity desert his post, though danger plainly threatens, nor can he reprove free men for their bad management or neglect of duty, for the necessity of his condition is upon him. Awarded the owner, a Creole man named Latour, awarded him $1,300. It seems right, put like that. But now, Dr. Sloan, Nettie, Domino was carefully examined by my doctor, old Fred Pierce. Why, Pierce hasn't drawn a sober breath in 20 years. He gets only slaves for his patients. Well, I reckon that makes him what they call a specialist, then. No, Ned, don't go to court. You have no case. My jailer will testify, too, that Domino was sound when I sold him. It must have been that whipping sickened him. Wickerson rose. Will you make partial restitution, then? The old man shook his head. His long hair was streaked with gray, but the face under it was still ruddy. You know Domino was sick, Wickerson said. I've spoken to old Miss Whitford's man Micah, the blacksmith, who was doing some work in your jail a while back. He told me that he heard Domino coughing, saw him spitting blood, saw you watching him, saw you give him some rum and molasses, heard you say, better not cough till I've sold you, Dom, else I'll have to sell you south where they don't coddle Negroes. This was just before you did sell him to my client. The old man's eyes narrowed. I'd say Micah talks overmuch for a black man, even one of old Miss Whitford's, a high and mighty lady that doesn't care to know me on the street. But you forget one mighty important thing, Mr. Wickerson. His voice rose. He pointed his finger. It makes no difference what Micah heard. Micah is property, just like my horse is property, and property can't testify. Do you claim to be a lawyer? Don't you know that a slave can't inherit, can't bequeath, can't marry nor give in marriage, can neither sue nor prosecute, and that it's a basic principle of the law that a slave can never testify in court except against another slave? Wickerson, his lips pressed tightly together, moved to the door, kicked it open, scattering a knot of idlers who stood around listening eagerly, and strode away. The old man brushed through them. And you'd better tell Sam Worth not to come bothering me either, Bayless shouted at Wickerson's back. I know how to take care of trash like him. He turned furiously to the gaping and grinning loungers. "Get away from here, you mudsills!" He was almost squeaking in his rage. "I reckon you don't own the sidewalks," they muttered. "I reckon every white man in this state is as good as any other white man," they said. But they gave way before him. The old man stamped back into his office and slammed the door. It was Bayless's custom to have his supper in his own house, a 2-story building just past the end of the sidewalk on Rampart Street. But tonight he felt disinclined to return there with no one but rheumatic-y old Edie, his housekeeper cook, for company. He got on his horse and rode down toward the cheerful bustle of the Phoenix Hotel. Just as he was about to go in, Sam Worth came out. Worth was a barrel-shaped man with thick, short arms and thick, bandy legs. He stood directly in front of Bayless, breathing whiskey fumes. "So you won't settle?" he growled. His wife, a stout woman taller than her husband, got down from their wagon and took him by the arm. "Come away now, Sam," she urged. "You better step aside," Bayless said. "I hear you've been making threats against me," Worth said. "Yes, and I'll carry them out, too, if you bother me." A group quickly gathered, but Mrs. Worth pulled her husband away, pushed him toward the wagon, and Bayless went inside. The buzz of talk dropped for a moment as he entered, stopped, then resumed in a lower register. He cast around for a familiar face, undecided where to sit, but it seemed to him that all faces were turned away. Finally, he recognized the bald head and bent shoulders of Dr. Pierce, who was slumped at a side table by himself, muttering into a glass. Bayless sat down heavily across from him with a sigh. Dr. Pierce looked up. "A graduate of the University of Virginia," the doctor said. His eyes were dull. "At it again." Bayless looked around for a waiter. Dr. Pierce finished what was in his glass. "Says he'll horsewhip you on sight," he muttered. "Who says?" Bayless was surprised. "Major Jack Moran." Bayless laughed. The major was a tottery veteran of the War of 1812 who rode stiffly about on an aged white mare. "What for?" he asked. "The talk is going around you mentioned a lady's name." Pierce beckoned, and at once a waiter, whose eye old man Bayless had not managed to catch, appeared with a full glass. Bayless caught his sleeve as the waiter was about to go and ordered his meal. The doctor drank. "Major Jack says, impossible to call you out. Can't appear on field of honor with slave trader. So instead, we'll whip you on sight." His voice gurgled in the glass. Bayless smiled crookedly. "I reckon I needn't be afraid of him. He's old enough to be my daddy." "A lady's name? What lady?" "Maybe he means a lady who lives in a big old house that's fallen apart. An old lady who lives on what her Negro blacksmith makes." Dr. Pierce made a noise of assent. He put down his glass. Bayless looked around the dining room, but as fast as he met anyone's eyes, the eyes glanced away. The doctor cleared his throat. "Talk is going around you expressed a dislike for said Negro. Talk is that the lady has said she is going to manumit him to make sure you won't buy him if she dies." Bayless stared. "Manumit him? She can't do that unless she posts a bond of $1,000 to guarantee that he leaves the state within 90 days after being freed. She must know that free Negroes aren't allowed to stay on after manumission. And where would she get $1,000? And what would she live on if Micah is sent away? That old lady hasn't got good sense." "No," Pierce agreed, staring at the glass. "She is old and not too bright, and she's got too much pride on too little money. But it's a His tongue stumbled. "A singular thing. There's hardly a person in this town, white or black or half-breed Injun, that doesn't love that certain old lady. Except you. And nobody in town loves you. Also a singular thing. Here we are." The doctor's teeth clicked against the glass. He set it down, swallowed. His eyes were yellow in the corners, and he looked at Bayless steadily, save for a slight trembling of his hands and head. "Here we are, heading just as certain as can be towards splitting the Union and having war with the Yankees, all over slavery, tied to it hand and foot, willing to die for it, economy bound up in it, sure in our own hearts that nature and justice and religion are for it, and yet, singular thing, nobody likes slave traders. Nobody likes them. Tell me something new. Bayliss drew his arms back to make room for his dinner. He ate noisily and with good appetite. Another thing, the doctor hunched forward in his seat, that hasn't added to your current popularity is this business of Domino. In this, I feel you made a mistake. Caveat emptor or not, you should have sold him farther away from here, much farther away, down to the rice fields somewhere, where his death would have been just a statistic in the overseer's annual report. Folks feel you've cheated Sam Worth. He's not one of your rich absentee owners who sits in town and lets some cheese-paring Yankee drive his Negroes. He only owns 4 or 5. He and his boy work right alongside them in the field, pace them row for row. Bayliss grunted, sopped up gravy. You've been defying public opinion for years now. There might come a time when you'd want goodwill. My advice to you, after all, your agent only paid $100 for Domino, is to settle with Worth for $500. Bayliss wiped his mouth on his sleeve. He reached for his hat, put it on, left money on the table, and got up. Shoemaker, stick to your last, he said. Dr. Pierce shrugged. Make that glass the final one. I want you at the jail tomorrow early so we can get the catalog ready for the big sale next week, hear? The old man walked out, paying no attention to the looks or comments his passage caused. On his horse, Bayliss hesitated. The night was rather warm, with a hint of damp in the air. He decided to ride around for a while in the hope of finding a breeze stirring. As the horse ambled along from one pool of yellow gaslight to another, he ran through in his mind some phrases for inclusion in his catalog. Phyllis, prime woman, aged 25, can cook, sew, do fine ironing. When he had first begun in the trade, 3 out of every 5 Negroes had been named Cuffy, Cujo, or Quash. He'd heard these were days of the week in some African dialect. There was talk that the African slave trade might be legalized again. That would be a fine thing. But there was always such talk on and off. The clang of a hammer on an anvil reminded him that he was close to Black Micah's forge. As he rounded the corner, he saw Sam Worth's bandy-legged figure outlined against the light. One of the horses was unhitched from his wagon and awaited the shoe Micah was preparing for it. A sudden determination came to Bayliss. He would settle with Worth about Domino. He hardly bothered to analyze his motives, partly because his dinner was resting well and he felt comfortable and unexpectedly benevolent, partly because of some vague notion it would be the popular thing to do and popularity was a good thing to have before and during a big sale. He made up his mind to offer Worth $300. Well, maybe he would go as high as $350, but no more. The man had to make something out of a trade. As he rode slowly up to the forge and stopped, the blacksmith paused in his hammering and looked out. Worth turned around. In the sudden silence, Bayliss heard another horse approaching. I've come to settle with you, the slave trader said. Worth looked up at him, his eyes bloodshot. In a low, ugly voice, Worth cussed him and reached his hand toward his rear pocket. It was obvious to Bayliss what Worth intended, so the slave trader quickly drew his own pistol and fired. His horse reared. A woman screamed. Did 2 women scream? Without his meaning it, the other barrel of his pistol went off just as Worth fell. For God's sake, don't kill me, Mr. Bayliss, Micah cried. Are you all right, Miss Elizabeth? He cried. Worth's wife and Miss Whitford suddenly appeared from the darkness on the other side of the wagon. They knelt beside Worth. Bayliss felt a numbing blow on his wrist, dropped his empty pistol, was struck again, and half fell, was half dragged from his horse. A woman screamed again. Men ran up. Where had they all come from? Bayliss, pinned in the grip of someone he couldn't see, stood dazed. "You infernal scoundrel! You shot that man in cold blood!" Old Major Jack Moran dismounted from his horse and flourished the riding crop with which he had struck Bayliss on the wrist. "I never. He cussed me. He reached for his pistol. I only defended myself." Worth's wife looked up, tears streaking her heavy face. "He had no pistol," she said. "I made him leave it home." "You said, 'I've come to get you,' and you shot him point blank," the old major's voice trumpeted. "He tried to shoot Miss Whitford, too," someone said. Other voices added that Captain Carter, the High Sheriff's chief deputy, was coming. Bodies pressed against Bayliss, faces glared at him. Fists were waved before him. "It wasn't like that at all," he cried. Deputy Carter came up on the gallop, flung the reins of his black mare to eager, outthrust hands, jumped off, and walked over to Worth. "How was it, then?" a scornful voice asked Bayliss. "I rode up. I says, 'I've come to settle with you.' He cussed at me low and mean, and he reached for his hip pocket." In every face he saw disbelief. "Major Jack's an old man," Bayliss faltered. "He heard it wrong. He heard it good enough to hang you." Bayliss looked desperately around. Carter rose from his knees, and the crowd parted. "Sam's dead, ma'am," he said. "I'm sorry." Mrs. Worth's only reply was a low moan. The crowd growled. Captain Carter turned and faced Bayliss, whose eyes looked at him for a brief second, then turned frantically away. And then Bayliss began to speak, anxiously, so anxiously that his words came out a babble. His arms were pinioned, and he could not point, but he thrust his head toward the forge where the blacksmith was still standing silently. "Micah," Bayliss stuttered. "Ask Micah." Micah saw it, he wanted to say, wanted to shout it. Micah was next to Worth. Micah heard what I really said. He's younger than the major. His hearing is good. He saw Worth reach. Captain Carter placed his hand on Bayliss and spoke, but Bayliss did not hear him. The whole night had suddenly fallen silent for him, except for his own voice, saying something it seemed long ago to young lawyer Wickerson. "It makes no difference what Micah saw. It makes no difference what Micah heard. Micah is property, and property can't testify." They tied Bayliss's hands and heaved him onto his horse. "He is fettered fast by the most stern bonds our laws take note of. Can't inherit, can't bequeath, can neither sue nor prosecute." Bayliss turned his head as they started to ride away. He looked at Micah, and their eyes met. Micah knew. "It's basic principle of the law that a slave can never testify in court except against another slave." Someone held the reins of old man Bayliss's horse. From now on, he moved only as others directed. The lights around the forge receded. Darkness surrounded him. The necessity of his condition was upon him.
All right, Robert, what'd you think?
I love that story. As I said, it's one of my two favorite of his, the other one being Lord of Central Park. I'd like to talk about it from a writer's point of view because there's so much going on in it. It's so cleverly done. One of the things that writers have to deal with all the time in fiction is what's called an expository dump. And that's the background that you have to put in the story that isn't part of the plot, but they have to know that this guy was an orphan, that this guy did that, and that this guy did that. And the important part that he has to put in this story is the fact that slaves cannot be witnesses. That is the absolutely important detail that he has to put in, and he has to put it in so it doesn't stand out like a red flag. And he puts it in that argument or discussion with a young lawyer in such a clever way that you'd never realize that it's a key detail to the story. It's just brilliantly done. Another thing is it's an example of what I call the just reward story, where the main character gets what's coming to him. And the usual version of a just reward story is what I call the bite or bit story, which is a subset. These are just my names for it, where a person commits a crime and the crime rebounds on them. But the thing about this is it's not a crime story in that sense, because everything the guy was doing was perfectly legal at the time. And yet, if you're like most people, I think nowadays you would despise this fellow, and you're glad he gets what's coming, even though he wasn't breaking the law. Isn't that interesting? Although it is certainly a crime story, isn't it?
Yeah.
And one more thing I wanted to say, I told you about this a little when we talked, but I actually looked it up. Abraham Lincoln speaking in 1854, so about 6 years before the Civil War started, he said, he's talking to slave owners about slave traders, like our hero, our main character in the story. You despise the slave trader utterly. You do not recognize him as a friend or even as an honest man. Your children must not play with his. They may rollick freely with the little Negroes, but not with the slave dealer's children. If you are obliged to deal with him, you try to get through the job without as much as touching him. So that's a guy at the time expressing or describing the same opinions that Avram was discussing. So he wasn't making it up.
Wow. I mean, it's fascinating. One of the things I mentioned earlier is just Avram had a deep sympathy for the weak and oppressed, and you could see it through a lot of his writing. I've talked about this in some of the other episodes. Now Let Us Sleep, or The Grasses Grow, and then we just published Skinny, and in this story as well. So it's a common theme, and as you mentioned, often things that people wouldn't publish at the time.
Yeah,
which is fascinating.
It's worth remembering that almost 10 years after the story was published, when Star Trek went on the air, the network didn't want to have an African American or an Asian on the show.
Yeah,
he said, yeah. Gene Roddenberry says, if we make it to the 23rd century, it's not going to be by having only white people.
Well, one thing, and I know, again, you're not a big movie person. One thing I do on every episode is I talk about who would play characters. And so for me, just very quickly, Bayless and Micah. So for Bayless, I thought the perfect person would originally, I thought of, let's see, where is he? I was initially thinking Tommy Lee Jones. I don't know who was in Men in Black. But he's probably a little too old to play the character now. Apologize.
He's pretty. I mean, the character's pretty old, right? He's got to be. He was in his middle ages 25 years ago, so that puts him at least 65.
Yeah. So I mean, it's definitely a possibility. I was thinking Josh Brolin, who plays him as a younger Tommy Lee Jones in Men in Black. So just kind of substitute. But Tommy Lee Jones, I think, is the person that came to my mind initially. And then for Micah, I thought of the actor Jonathan Majors, who's the main character in Lovecraft Country, who plays Atticus Freeman, which I don't know if you've seen it. I've just started watching it, but I thought it'd be perfect. Well, any other thoughts on the story that you'd want to share?
I'm trying to see if I had any in my notes. By the way, I love the narrator on this one.
Yeah. Stefan Rudnicki, he is fantastic. He does all of Robert Silverberg's stories, and he also does, a lot of the science fiction authors out there. He does.
I don't know if he has a natural Southern accent, but he had just a little touch of a Southern accent, which was perfect.
Yeah, and especially given, I mean, we didn't talk about that at all, which is the border town.
Right.
You never know where it is, but you know it's a border town. And
of course, it's accurate that the border states, they weren't plantation states. You couldn't have hundreds of slaves.
Right.
So that was the right place to put the story for the problem he was describing, the problem that there were too many Negroes.
Yeah. It was really sickening. I mean, part of that story is It was tough. Well, are there any authors, since you know this area, are there any authors that you'd recommend for Avram Davidson fans who love this story, other stories like it, that you'd recommend that they read and check out?
Absolutely. One is John Collier.
Mm-hmm.
You can find his book, Fancies and Good Nights. I just bought a copy a couple of months ago, because I'd been thinking about him and realized I didn't have any of his books. And that one won both the Edgar for Best Short Stories, back then they gave it to a book, and the Fantasy Award.
Oh, wow.
And as I said, the single work, getting both, is pretty amazing. And he had that same kind of explosive imagination that I associate with Avram. Another is an author who's still around with us today, James Powell. He's a Canadian author.
Okay.
Who has this machine gun imagination that just shoots off ideas. I always point out he wrote a short story about an armchair detective story. An armchair detective story is the one in which the main character never leaves the house. He just listens to the crime and solves it. But he wrote an armchair detective story in which the detective is an armchair. So yeah, it's not an idea everybody could come up with.
Have you? Go ahead.
No, that's it.
Out of curiosity, and it's a little bit off topic before we go here, but have you read any of Avram's Esterhazy stories?
Long time ago.
Okay.
I have the book. I haven't read them in a long time.
I'd be so curious, and we don't have to do that here, but one of these days, I'd be so curious your take on those. They are so fantastical, but they're also, I feel, like mystery stories. It has a little bit of everything. And
obviously they didn't make my top list. But as I said, I read them a long time ago. I have the book, but haven't read them recently.
Okay. Well, look, I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to keeping in touch.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for tuning me into your podcast.
Thank you for being here.